Welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Melissa Clarke, and we're starting a week in Canberra that will be dominated by an issue at the heart of politics: tax. There's going to be a two-day tax forum in Canberra tomorrow and on Wednesday, followed by a jobs summit. To join us to look at what is going to be coming up, we have the Liberal MP Jane Prentice from Queensland. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Melissa.
And Greens Senator for Victoria, Richard Natale. Thanks for being with us too.
G'day, Melissa.
And before we get started, let's have a look at what both the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer and how they're shaping up for the tax forum when they spoke a little earlier today.
If it is going to be treated seriously by the Australian people, then the government actually has to have an immediate action agenda coming out of the tax summit. Calling all these people to Canberra and delivering nothing will simply reinforce the view that the Gillard government is all talk and no delivery.
We will not be looking at increasing the rate or the base of the GST. That is a long-standing commitment of the government, and that remains. Now, I know a lot of people out there have a view that is different from the government. They will be free to express that view. But for the government's point of view, we have absolutely no intention of increasing the rate or the base of the GST. We regard that as lazy tax reform.
Richard Natale, is there much point in having this tax forum if the government is going to rule so many things out before the forum even begins?
Oh, well, I think it's important that the government hears from a range of players in this arena. I think it's really a valuable thing to do. But I do agree with Joe Hockey that we do need to see some concrete action coming out of the forum. We'd like to see, for example, a return to the original mining tax to bring in revenue that's currently going offshore. We'd like to see the company tax rate for small business.
The government said they're not going to countenance any change to the mining tax.
Look, that's the point of having the forum, is to have these issues fleshed out. I think it's important for the government to hear from a range of voices, but we do need to see some concrete action coming out of this. For example, a reduction in the rate that small businesses pay in terms of company tax rate. We want to see that reduced from 30 to 25%. We'd like to see a much more rational approach to the taxation of alcohol, for example. So, look, it's important to have the forum, but Joe Hockey's right. We do need to see some action. The government does need to work methodically with a range of stakeholders after the forum, with the tax office, with Treasury, to make sure that some of the best ideas coming from the summit are acted on.
Jane Prentice, Richard Natale raises some good ideas there for tax reform. Wayne Swan says that the opposition have been invited to take part, but they don't want a bar of it. Why not get involved?
Well, Melissa, as you said before, this is just a talk fest. They've already ruled out having any discussion about the carbon tax or the mineral resources tax. That's already off limits. And let's not forget, this is the same government that spent over $10 million on the Henry review of the tax system. They had over 1,500 submissions and it cost over $10 million. So really, this is nothing more than a talk fest. As we all know, it's only because they promised Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor that they would have this forum so that they could form a government. And quite frankly, that was supposed to happen before the 30th of June, so they've already missed their deadline on that one.
One of the topics we're going to be hearing a lot about at the tax forum is support for Australia's manufacturing industry. That's something that both business groups and unions are pushing heavily for. There's been the idea of having tax concessions for companies that have a particular amount of local content, say how much steel they use in infrastructure projects. Jane Prentice, would that be something the coalition would be willing to support?
Well, Melissa, once again, they're discussing problems that they have created themselves through the carbon tax. So why are we trying to solve problems that shouldn't be created in the first place?
It's not just the carbon tax, though. I mean, the high Australian dollar is putting a lot of pressure on the steel industry as well. It's a structural issue too.
Well, it's also the economic failures of this government which have caused the problems in the first place. And so whilst we obviously support the manufacturing industry, what we're saying is get back to basics, get rid of this carbon tax, which is just putting another burden on all our industry, and particularly the manufacturing industry. And this forum, this talk fest, isn't going to solve any of those problems.
Okay, and just briefly, Richard, would the Greens be willing to support tax concessions when it comes to local content in projects?
Look, we're open to that. In fact, our member in the lower house, Adam Bant, will be calling for a manufacturing inquiry to look at that amongst a range of other options, local content rules and so on, because we do have an issue with manufacturing in this country. We do want to be a country that continues to make things. So the Greens are calling for an inquiry into manufacturing to look precisely at this along with a range of other possible options.
OK, let's move on to another issue, and that's of how much both of you are getting paid, because the Remuneration Tribunal is going to have a review of politicians' pay, what level it is at now, and perhaps ways of changing how you are paid and what entitlements that MPs and senators are allowed to have. Let's first of all hear from Richard's boss, from the Greens leader Bob Brown, and what he had to say on this issue.
Politicians are doing quite well, and the Greens were the only party that opposed the transfer, this very clever but rather cowardly transfer of all power to a committee of 3 men, rather than Parliament taking responsibility for politicians' pay rises. It always should be our responsibility. We should be able to debate pay rises, the merits of them.
Richard, given what Bob Brown has said there, does that mean if the Remuneration Tribunal announced it thought you should get more pay, that you wouldn't take it?
Look, Melissa, I've always chosen my work according to job satisfaction. That's been the primary driver for me. I've been very lucky, one of those fortunate people in life that has had a very fulfilling career in medicine and now in politics. The driver for me was about making a difference. I'm lucky in that I'm in a political party that now is in a position where it can make a difference. I've been working on things like getting a publicly funded dental health scheme up and running and off the ground. And look, if I can achieve that, that's reward enough for me. I'll be able to retire and look back on my work in the Senate and know that I've done something decent.
That doesn't quite answer the question, though. If the Remuneration Tribunal gives you a pay rise, will you take it?
I think with the Remuneration Tribunal, there are a number of things they'll be looking at. What I've noticed, I started this job 3 months ago, and there's a really confusing maze of things like entitlements and allowances and so on. If the tribunal came up with something that reformed all of those things, that ensured that we actually simplified it, made it a lot more flexible, then I think that might be a good thing. I'll wait and see what with the findings of the tribunal. I'll see what they come up with and then have a look at that. And I think with our colleagues we'll make a decision about how we're going to approach it.
Jane Prentice, is it right that these decisions about politicians' pay are made by an independent umpire, or should politicians be accountable for how much they get paid and have to make that decision themselves?
No, I don't think politicians should be making decisions about their own salary and their own expenses. I think it's right that an independent tribunal does that. And can I say, I really don't know anyone on either side of the political fence that went into politics for the salary. Most of the people I know have gone in for reasons like Richard suggested, or because they want to help people. I don't know anyone who's gone into politics because after the salary.
Do you think the Prime Minister and senior cabinet ministers should be paid more, given how much senior public bureaucrats are being paid? We know that the head of the Defence Force, the tax commissioner, they're all being paid in the order of $800,000. Should senior members of government be paid an equivalent amount?
Well, you mentioned the Prime Minister. I just do believe that the Prime Minister should be paid more. She is working 24/7. She's on call the whole time. She has no private life to speak of. And I don't think it's wrong that she should be paid more.
Richard, quickly, your view on that one?
The words of the famous philosopher Kierkegaard come to mind, and that comparison is the source of all unhappiness. I'm happy with my lot in life at the moment, and I'll leave it there.
All right, moving on the weekend, I'll come back to Bob Brown again because on the weekend he spoke in Sydney and raised the idea of licensing for the press, which is something he's talked about before in view of the media inquiry that we will have shortly. But he also raised the idea of perhaps having some kind of licensing system for individual journalists. Richard, is this new Greens policy?
Look, I think what Bob's getting at is the issue of accountability. We are in a situation at the moment where the Greens have been supporting a media inquiry because we're always treading this line between free speech, something that I've fought for a long time, but also the responsibility that comes with that, particularly among journalists where their position is one of considerable influence. So we need to make sure that accountability is first and foremost the thing that we continue to fight for. And one of the ways we can achieve it is through ensuring that the bodies that regulate the press, for example, like the Australian Press Council, that those bodies have some teeth, and I think that's the first way to go. That's the focus of the inquiry at the moment, and we'll be making sure that we try and get some more accountability into what is currently a debate where often statements are made by...
There's a difference there between giving ACMA more teeth and having licences for journalists that could somehow be used to perhaps revoke or stop them depending on their behaviour. Are you talking about going that far? Because that sounds rather authoritarian.
No, I know that's something that the Labor Party, for example, in Britain are considering at the moment. No, we want to put these questions to the media inquiry. We think that what is at the heart of it is ensuring that while journalists do have the ability to be able to speak freely, they also have the responsibility to make sure that they're held to account, that they shouldn't make deliberately false and misleading comments. So my view is that we can achieve that through ensuring that the current bodies, like the Press Council and ACMA, do have more teeth and are able to, that their powers are wider. And so we ensure a much better standard in the profession. I think all journalists would want to see that.
Jane Prentice, do you think when it comes to regulation of the media that you need to look at some kind of system to rein in individual journalists, or is it enough to look at regulation and control when it comes to media organisations?
No, look, I think this is basically an attack on free speech. This is an outrageous attack by Bob Brown. And who is a journalist these days? I mean, Bob Brown has opinion pieces in the paper regularly. Does he say he should be licensed as well? In today's era of social media and blogs, everyone's a journalist. And the great thing about our democracy is that you have a right to say something, even if it is unpopular. And I don't see it appropriate that these journalists should be licensed.
All right, and one last topic, of course, having just had the weekend of grand finals that we have had with both the AFL and NRL grand finals, what we have is that colliding with politics when it comes to the issue of poker machine regulation, and there's been some new developments with the independent Senator Nick Xenophon and the independent MP Andrew Wilkie writing to Channel 9 to complain about some of the commentary in NRL games about poker machine reform and whether it constituted political advertising. Jane, is all fair in love and war and politics when it comes to these sorts of things?
Well, I mean, I think, I didn't hear the comments, but I understand that it was a couple of sports commentators talking about it, which I don't think any reasonable person would take to be any more than their own personal view. I don't think it was an advertisement on behalf of Channel 9. So I think that's a bit over the top to be complaining about their comments. Once again, what's happening to free speech in this country? What happened to respecting the right of individuals, commentators, anyone, to have their say freely and to be criticised as well?
And just finally, very briefly, Richard, do you think the NRL and Channel 9 overstepped the mark with those comments, or is that just part of the hurly-burly?
Oh no, I certainly do. I mean, if you hear the statements, they were little more than political statements. They should have come with an endorsement. And I think that I'd be interested to hear what the role of Channel 9 was in improving those statements, because they were pure propaganda from the industry, almost verbatim. And I think there's a real question to answer there.
Richard Di Natale in Melbourne, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
And Jane Prentice in Brisbane, thank you to you too.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Richard.
And that's all for Capitol Hill this week. For today. We'll be back this time tomorrow.